change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Acts. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh.
It's not like he's backslidden, but the fact is that Paul here, that he's in the middle of God's will, and God has not only allowed this, but God, he's still the one who's in control here, and he's guiding the ship. And so you might ask, well, why does God allow this if we're being obedient to God and if we're walking in his will? And that's because what we learn here are these priceless things about God through these storms that we can learn in no other way. Where these kind of storms in our lives, they can be anything. They can be things like a broken marriage. They can be things like your health or your children. They're storms where you see no hope, where you know that you will not survive it. But God, he uses these storms in our lives to give us character, perseverance, and a humility. It gives us a depth of relationship with our commitment to God. And we learn to be more caring of other people and more sympathetic than we ever have before. Because the truth is, in these storms, we do make it, though we never thought we would. And it's not because we have a grip on God or our faith. It's because we learn that God, he has a grip on us. Where these kind of storms, they purify our faith. All right, so Romans 5:3. But we also glory in tribulations, knowing that our tribulation produces perseverance, and perseverance character, and character hope. Where Paul here, he has even lost his hope because he feels that God's absent. But the storm here, it doesn't get the final word. God does. Where sometimes it might feel like we've been abandoned by God, but it's actually the opposite. And so here are a couple of scriptures that remind us of God's faithfulness to us, with one being Philippians 1:6. Being confident of this very thing, that he who has begun a good work in you will complete it until the day of Jesus Christ. And that's what Paul wrote to the Philippian church. But you have to realize that he only wrote that after he went through this storm, because that letter was written when he was imprisoned in Rome. And so you have to think, well, where do you think he learned that from? And then you have 2 Timothy 2:13, where it says, if we are faithless, he remains faithful. He cannot deny himself. Where you learn that none of God's deliverances, they've ever depended on our faith. They've always been dependent on God's faithfulness. He's the one who gets us through the storms. So we bring nothing to the table. It has nothing to do with our faith, but it has all to do with God's faithfulness. And it doesn't even matter if we believe these promises, because God, he believes these promises. He does. And so Paul, then he tells his I told you so. So he has his I told you so moment. And I don't know if this is really such a great time for Paul to say to all these perishing people that I told you so. But what it seems that he's saying here to these people when he says, men, you should have listened to me and not have sailed from Crete. What he's saying is that you should have listened to me then, but I'm only bringing that up so that you will listen to me now. Because if they listen to Paul now, there will be no loss of life, but only of the ship. Where we see here in Paul's hopelessness, God sent Paul an angel to encourage him. Where the very first thing that this angel says to Paul is, do not be afraid. And that's because Paul too, he had lost all his hope. And Paul, he was very afraid. And then this angel encourages Paul by reminding Paul of what Jesus actually said to Paul. you must be brought before Caesar. And then that angel, he tells Paul that God is going to answer your prayer, that God has granted you all those who sail with you. So all these people that Paul has been interceding for, they're all going to be saved. And then Paul said, therefore, which means because of what all the angels said there, he says to them, he says, take heart. And then Paul, he gives them the bad news, where Paul tells them what will happen. And this is a prophetic word because it really does come to pass, where they will be shipwrecked and they will run aground on a certain island. But they're not told the name of the island here. And so it doesn't seem like it here, but God, he is directing the ship. But even after Paul's encouraging words, this storm, it doesn't end. Because we read here that it says the 14th night, but then something happens to change, where they're taking these soundings, and then they're finding out that they're approaching land way too quickly. And so they drop 4 anchors to slow them down before they hit the rocks. And then some of the sailors, they try to steal that skiff, which means it's because of their unbelief. But then they're told that all hands were needed for them to survive. So Paul tells the centurion, and you can see here that Julius, he's starting to believe Paul, where he has the ropes cut that are holding the skiff. That all happened at the night. But when morning comes, Paul, he encourages everyone to eat something, because these guys, they haven't eaten anything in 2 weeks, and they're going to need their strength. And then he tells them again that they're all going to survive. And then he gives thanks and he breaks the bread in the Jewish custom. And then with all of them believing Paul, they throw the rest of the grain into the sea to lighten the ship. Then they see the land and a beach, and they don't know where they are, but now they're going to make their final attempt to make it to that beach. And so they let go of those 4 anchors, and at the same time, they raise the sails to try to get enough speed to drive the ship into the ground. And it worked, but the ship, it didn't make it to shore, but it was caught on the rocks and became unmovable. And we're told that it's where 2 seas meet. So there's these 2 seas that are battling it out, where now these waves are breaking the ship apart. And all they can do is jump ship and try to make it to land. And so now you've got the soldiers, and they come up with their plan to kill all the prisoners on board, because they know that if any of them escape their guard, they're going to suffer the same consequences as their prisoner. And you have to remember that all of these prisoners, except for Paul, are to be executed. But because the centurion in charge, because he's become Paul's friend, he wants to save Paul. And so he doesn't allow it, and he finds parts of the ship to be used as floats for those who can't swim. And so he does all of those things at risk to himself, and they all make it. And now this shipwreck, we know that this shipwreck, it occurred in November. And then they find out that this island is Malta, which is a small island off of Sicily, where that name Malta, it actually means refuge. And that place that they landed in Malta today is called St. Paul's Bay. And then we have verse 2, and it says, natives showed us unusual kindness. But in the old King James, the word used for natives is barbarians. But you really kind of don't want to think of these islanders as these half-dressed natives, this wild bunch like in the South Pacific Islands, because these people were civilized. They are a part of the Roman Empire. And the only reasons they're called barbarians is because they don't speak Greek. Where Greeks, they called anybody who didn't speak Greek a barbarian. They thought their language was so beautiful that anything anybody else spoke sounded like bar, 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 bar. So they kind of thought it sounded like French, And I don't know if you've ever seen that episode about Joey speaking French, but this is what I picture. It tells us that these Maltese people, that they're really showing this unusual kindness, because you have to realize it's not every day you see 276 people walking out of the seas, and they're not only wet from the sea, but they're also wet from the rains, and they're all convicted criminals and soldiers. Where these natives, instead of being suspicious of them, they welcome them and they make a fire to warm them up to dry off. Where they've put everything else aside and they take care of their human needs first. And the first thing that you see the Apostle Paul do when he gets to shore is he starts serving, where he starts gathering sticks for the fire. Where you see that Paul, he is a servant, where he doesn't think of himself as being too important at all to do kind of menial work. And then he's feeding the fire when the heat wakes up this poisonous viper that attaches himself to Paul's hand. And everybody, they see that viper and they see it hanging down off his hand. So nobody in anyone's mind here doesn't believe that that viper has broken the skin, that its venom is going into Paul's blood. And so now they're just all waiting for Paul to swell up and drop dead, with all these native people saying, "No doubt this man's a murderer. Though he's escaped the sea, yet justice does not allow it to live." Where that is actually a Maltese saying, "Yet justice does not allow to live." Where what they're actually referring to there is the Greek goddess of justice, who they called Dike. Because these islanders, they know that Paul is a prisoner, but they're assuming that Paul committed some kind of great crime where he's not to go unpunished. But Paul, he just shakes off that viper into the fire and he goes on as if nothing ever happened. And so after a little while, they all change their mind about Paul. And so now he's not a murderer, but now he's a god, which isn't the first time that the pagans made Paul out to be a god. But this time they're not trying to sacrifice to him. And this gives Paul the opportunity to be entertained by Publius, who is the leading citizen, which is a technical term for a person who represented Rome on the island. And it says that Publius entertained them for 3 days, which is quite generous. Because the way that this reads, it means that all 276 of them were entertained by Publius. And Paul, he laid his hand and prayed for Publius's father, who had dysentery, which what some people believe was called Malta fever, which is caused by drinking impure goat's milk. And then after that, and after he was healed, all the sick were brought to Paul, and they were all healed. But the word for healed here, it's not our typical word for healed, where this word literally means to receive medical attention. Okay, where it says they honored him. And what it means by them honoring, it's most probably meaning that they gave him money. Because everywhere else in the book of Acts, this Greek word used here is used for money. And you have to kind of remember that these people here, they don't have anything. They lost everything in the shipwreck. And they remain here in Malta for 3 months, which is the rest of the winter. Okay, so now it's February, and the seas are now safe to travel. And Julius, he secures passage on another Alexandrian ship. So this is the same exact kind of ship. They just crashed and shipwrecked, where it's another grain ship that's been harboring in Malta for the winter. And this Alexandrian ship has a figurehead on the bow, and all Alexandrian ships had figureheads on the bow. And this one, it's called the Twin Brothers, which everybody knew back then was Castor and Pollux, which is our constellation of what we call Gemini, who were the patron gods who were worshipped by the sailors to look after them. So these were the ones that they looked to for good luck. Okay, so now they sail 80 miles to Syracuse, which is in Sicily, and they stay there for 3 days. And then they travel 75 miles to Rhegium, which is at the bottom of Italy, so that's right at the tip of the boot. And then they sail up the peninsula 180 miles to Puteoli, which is a port at Naples, which is south of Pompeii. And they stay there for 7 days, where Paul found some Christians, and he was invited to stay with them. But we never found out who established the church in Puteoli, or for that matter, we've never figured out who established the church in Rome. But from that city, they begin their 150-mile walk to Rome. All right, so now we have this 60-year-old man who's old, because that's old in the ancient world, and he's a Jewish rabbi, and he's chained up along with all these other prisoners who are being paraded to Rome, where Paul, he's being identified with all these convicted murderers who are heading toward their death. And so they're walking on their death march. And he's having to share in all of their humiliation and shame as they walk along the Appian Way on this Roman road through all these little towns and villages. And Paul, he has no idea what the outcome of his trial will be. And then we get down to verse 15, where they're not even halfway on their walk to Rome. And then we see that there's these Christians all coming from Rome who heard Paul was coming. Were these people, they never met Paul before, and they wanted to meet him before he got to Rome. So what they did is they walked those 43 miles from Rome just to find Paul, to escort this chained, abused prisoner to Rome, where they're honoring him as if he was a returning emperor. And so they're going to walk back with him, that 43 miles back with him as he's chained. Where Paul, he didn't know they were coming, where though they've never met Paul, they loved Paul. And that's because they had already read his letter to the Romans, because they would have received that letter about 4 years earlier. And somehow they got word that Paul was coming. And they all walked for 10 more miles closer to Rome. And then it happens all over again with more Christians who have added themselves to this escort, where they're going to walk that last 33 miles back with Paul. And this has a great impact on Paul, because this was the encouragement that Paul needed at this time. Where this is giving him the courage to go where he's about to go. And Paul, he gives thanks to God for this, because Paul now sees that he's not alone in his pilgrimage, where the power of their physical presence goes beyond any words. Because there's a big difference between just saying words and actually being there for someone, where your physical presence speaks much louder than any words, and it shows your love. Where you know that Julius, the centurion here, he's never seen anything ever like this happen with a prisoner. And this is why it's so important for each of us to go to church, that we're not supposed to forsake meeting with each other, because we need each other's physical presence to build each other up. You can't really do the same job from a distance. And you have to see these people that come, that none of them are identified by name here. These are just regular Christians. These are people just like us. They're not apostles, they're not leaders. They're just people willing to share his persecution and his humiliation, which is why Hebrews 10:24 and 25 says, "And let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together in the manner of some, but exhorting one another, and so much more as we see the day approaching." Okay, so now we get to verse 16, and here we have the last of the we sections with Dr. Luke when they get to Rome. And in Rome at this time, they have a population of over 2 million people, with 1 million of these people being slaves. And then Julius, he delivers all the other prisoners to the captain of the guard, but Paul here, he's permitted to rent his own apartment, where he's under house arrest with only one guard. And because Paul's under house arrest, he can't go out and visit the other local Jewish synagogues. So Paul, he invites the Jewish leaders to his home, where Paul, he explains to them why he's in Roman custody, and he explains his innocence and how the Romans, that they didn't find fault with him and wanted to let him go. But it's all because he appealed to Caesar that they couldn't let him go. And so now Paul, he tells these local Jewish leaders from the Roman synagogue that he's not going to accuse the Jews of anything before the Roman. He doesn't want to make it any tougher on the Jews in Rome, because if you remember, the Emperor Claudius, all the Jews were commanded to leave Rome. But now here under Nero, some of the Jews are being allowed to return to Rome. So Paul, he doesn't want to bring any more trouble on these people, because he loves the Jewish people so deeply, no matter how they have treated him. And then Paul tells these leaders of the synagogue that he's called to tell them about what he's spoken in all the synagogues, about Jesus, who's the hope of Israel. And that's the reason he's in chains. And Paul, he's expecting that they all heard of him, that they've all heard about his encounter with the Jerusalem Jews. But they haven't heard a thing. The Jewish leaders from Jerusalem, even though they knew that Paul appealed to Caesar and they knew he was going to Rome, they never ever sent word to the local synagogues in Rome. And you just have to figure that they figured that they couldn't win their little case in a little local court, that they would have no chance in Rome with Caesar Nero, or else somehow they just lost interest. But you have to see here also that the Christians in Rome, they knew what was going on with Paul, where the Jews, they didn't. But the Jews here in Rome, they're open to hearing about Jesus, this new sect of Judaism that they've heard that's been spoken against everywhere. And so they're invited to come on a specific day, and Paul went through the scriptures with them, and it took him the whole day because there's so much to go through. Because there is over 300 prophecies in the Old Testament just about Jesus' first coming, not to mention his second coming. And some of them believe, but not all of them, where now they begin to argue with each other. And then Paul explains why they can't hear the truth and why they're dull of hearing. Where Paul explains to them that it was always right for him to go to the Jews first, but then he tells them that this salvation that they're rejecting, God is sending to the Gentiles, and they'll believe it. And that's exactly what happened, where the church today is mostly made up of Gentile believers. But the Jews today, they're still dull of hearing, but it's not all Jews. Some Jews, they come to Jesus. And then you have the book of Acts end here with no big spectacular ending. And we're never given the outcome of Paul's case. All we know is that he's going to be under house arrest for the next 2 years where he receives guests. And the reason it's believed that there's no big conclusion here, or it's believed by some, the whole reason that this was written, because you have to realize that the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, at one time was just one document. And they believe that this was put together by Luke to give to the Roman court to establish the facts and the background about Paul's case before his trial before Caesar. But we do know because of Paul's letter to the Philippians that Paul tells us that he expected to be released, where most Bible teachers agree that Paul was released after his first trial with Nero. We do also know things like where during that first imprisonment, he also met Onesimus, which was Philemon's runaway slave, where Paul led him to Christ. And this is also the place where Paul wrote the 4 prison epistles, which was Colossians, Philippians, Ephesians, and Philemon. And if he was never imprisoned, he would have just went to these places, and we wouldn't have these books in our Bible. But Acts ends, and we never hear what happens in the trial. But it's believed that when he was released, that Paul, he traveled as far as Spain. And then after this imprisonment, Paul, he wrote his 2 letters to Timothy and to Titus, where finally in 67 AD, it's believed that Paul was arrested again under different circumstances, where he didn't get to stay in a house, but he had to go to prison and he was treated as a criminal. And the last thing we hear from Paul is that he's asking Timothy to bring his cloak, where Paul was forsaken by all the believers in Rome. And it says, even including Demas, except for Luke, that Luke remained loyal to him to the end. And then the church tradition tells us that Paul, he was convicted and executed at the command of Nero in 67 or 68 AD.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,